So a guy walks into a doctor's office and he says, "Doc, I hurt everywhere. Everywhere I touch it hurts." So the doctor says, "What do you mean?" So the patient says, if I touch my shoulder it hurts. If I touch my chest it hurts. If I touch my head it hurts." So after a moment the doctor says, "I think I know what's wrong with you. I think you broke your finger." Now, that's an old joke, but the doctor was correct in that he was looking for a deeper underlying issue than what the patient was saying. And my whole point in telling you that joke is that on the face of it, anxiety and depression, they seem like different things, but are actually underpinned by the same fundamental problem, which is attention, mind wandering. So more specifically, a hyperactive default mode network and a proclivity to engage in ruminative thinking. So in this video, I want to link depression and anxiety for you guys by talking about the three things they have in common, which are a dysfunctional or hyperactive default mode network, some form of rumination, and negative feedback loops. And once we've covered those three things, I'll share with you the most logical, effective, low-cost treatment plan out there that doesn't involve bathing your brain in a bunch of SSRIs or Benzodiazepines until the end of time. So back in 2001, a neurologist named Dr. Marcus Raichle had people in an fMRI machine when he noticed that whenever people weren't engaged in a specific task, this one area of the brain started to light up. And because this is what the brain was seemingly defaulting to when it wasn't engaged in a specific task, he called it the default mode network. So flash forward about 19 years later, and what we've discovered about this network so far is that it's basically related to anything involving the self. So autobiographical thinking, unlinking for the present moment and thinking about ourselves, self-monitoring, self-reflection, self versus other modalities of thought, imagination, metacognition, and so on. It's been called the orchestrator of the self by its discoverer, the control center of the brain by Dr. David Nutt, and an incredibly important integration hub by Dr. Robin Carhart Harris. It's also been posited as the neural substrates of the ego. Long story short, if I had to point to the you that you're feeling right now, I'd point to this picture, because it's only when this network gets disintegrated or suppressed, like in meditative states, psychedelic states, or flow states, that people's sense of self starts to disappear as well. My point is, when you unlink from the present moment too often and you start thinking about yourself, we see increased activation in this network. And when we scan the brains of people that are anxious and depressed, what we find is that these networks are hyperactive. They have dense connectivity. These people cannot seem to stay grounded in the present moment because they keep letting their minds wander. So just for context, there's a study from Harvard published in the journal Science, which found that people spend 46.9% of their waking life thinking about something other than what they're doing. The name of the article, "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind," because all this mind wandering isn't reality, it's fantasy. People let their minds think about whatever it wants, which often results in some form of negative feedback loops. Now, of course, you'll read that depression is also underpinned by high scores of rumination, so replaying an event over and over in your mind's eye. So that stupid thing you said, that stupid thing you did. People who get depressed tend to not leave the past in the past where it belongs, but bring it into the present and keep beating themselves up about something that happened a long time ago. So they let their brains engage in these negative feedback loops, which in turn get burned into their neurocircuitry, which is how the default mode network gets so dysfunctional to begin with. So broadly speaking, depressed people obsess about the past and what happened, while anxious people obsess about the future and what might happen. So depressed people ruminate, while anxious people worry. But what is worry other than a form of forward-thinking rumination? I mean, it's still rumination, only it isn't past events people are beating themselves up about. It's future events that haven't even happened yet. Events that statistically couldn't happen. Then people let all these hypotheticals, false beliefs, and what-ifs dominate their mental experience to such an extent that it actually sends them to the hospital. When the hyperactive worry system is off the charts, it can induce panic attacks and heart palpitations. And whenever people have to go to the emergency room for this, everybody seems to agree this is a bad thing. But when it doesn't send people on an acute trip to the hospital, but rather an ambulance ride that takes 20 years to get there, people don't tend to do anything about it. Instead, what they do is they self-identify as being a worrier, thinking, well, there's nothing I can do, while this hyperactive worry system shaves years off their life. The problem is, and it blows my mind more people don't know this, but The brain hardly makes a distinction between physical pain and emotional pain. At the end of the day, it's all happening up here. So whether the cause be physical or emotional, the same stress hormone is released. Now here's an excerpt from my wife and I's upcoming book, Consciousness in a Nutshell. Consider the following psychiatric disorders: OCD, panic attacks, major depressive disorder, hypochondria, agoraphobia, generalized anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. Now you could ask the question, what do all these disorders have in common? And the answer seems to be worrying. Worrying is at the epicenter of all these mental illnesses, and as you're probably already aware, worry is something that enhances anxiety, not suppresses it. To quote an old Swedish proverb, worry often gives a small thing a big shadow. It's the thing that creates stress in our lives, practically out of thin air. Forget about worry, an event of the mind, physically causing the stress hormone cortisol to be released, wreaking havoc on our physical bodies and literally aging us. People who suffer from PTSD will often exhibit physiological changes in their neurobiology. In particular, they tend to have a hyperactive amygdala and a hypoactive prefrontal cortex. Physiological changes all stemming from something they either saw or they did. The obsessive-compulsive believes he has to wash his hands 5 times after touching a door, and because of this belief, his hands are rubbed raw. The agoraphobic worries so much about what could happen if they leave the house, they never do. Someone with panic attacks believes so strongly they're about to die that they physically get pain in their chest and start to hyperventilate. Someone with recurrent major depressive disorder believes that their life isn't living with such intensity that they end up taking their own life. Worry, fear, belief, repeat. So how do you stop worrying? Before we answer that, let's pry up the hood here and really examine this problem with a fine-tooth comb, because believe it or not, there's something more fundamental than worry going on, and that's our ability to direct focus, to choose where we put our time and energy. In other words, we're back to attention again. Now are you beginning to see why I invited a monk to come stay at my place? I mean, if you knew that hyperactive large-scale networks like the emotional salience network or the default mode network generally cause dysfunction, wouldn't you do everything in your power to stop it? Even in disorders like ADD and ADHD, you could ask, what's the underlying issue here? And again, we're back to attention. Now, I don't want to demonize the default mode network too bad, because we actually need it to navigate our complex social environment. But the only difference between a tool and a weapon is the operator. The only difference between a medicine and a poison, the dose. The default mode network is a thinking tool, but when it gets to be overconnected and there's dysfunction there, it starts to create unnecessary stress in our lives. And as you're probably already aware, stress is the catalyst for almost every illness I can think of, physical and mental. And, by the way, let's not forget about how stress affects our mood and how we treat other people. I mean, who would you rather hang out with? Someone who's stressed and depressed, or someone who's relaxed and chill? Or how about this? Who's likely to treat you better? Someone who perpetually exists in a state of anxiety, or someone who's relaxed and easygoing? Or how about this one? Who would you rather have a conversation with? Someone who can't stay present and grounded because they're too busy focused on what might happen 2 weeks from now? Or someone who's focused on the only moment that ever matters? Anxiety and depression are fundamentally the same thing because they are both problems with attention. Now, conscious attention is sometimes likened to being like a spotlight of attention. So in order to get out of these negative feedback loops, we need to stop pointing the spotlight on ourselves and start pointing it on something else. And if you're unsure about what a feedback loop is, all you need to really do is hook up a microphone to a PA system and then point the microphone at a speaker. As long as your microphone is pointed at a speaker, a deafening howl will be all you can hear, because a microphone is really just an amplification device. So you speak into a mic, the signal travels out, goes to the speaker, and comes out louder. But if you have the microphone pointed at a speaker, then what happens is the noise from the speaker goes into the mic, it amplifies the signal comes out even louder, goes back to the mic, and then this loops around, and in less than 2 seconds, an audible limit is reached and a deafening howl pierces through the crowd. This happens at almost every live event I've ever been to, and it baffles me how more people don't understand this is what's happening. So my point is this: we have a conscious attention, a spotlight of attention, which is very much like that microphone. It's an amplification device, and as long as we're pointing it at ourselves, a feedback loop is likely to occur. So for some people, it's, I'm so awesome, I'm so great, there's never been anyone better, while they just, keep reality at bay, and the system just feeds back on itself. But for most people, it's, I'm so horrible, I'm so awful, and the system just feeds back on itself again. Of course you're awful. You can't even hold down a job. You get the idea. So the treatment option for both depression and anxiety is to stop your mind from wandering. Take back control of your attention. And the simplest way I know how to do that is to start focusing on the needs of other people. To focus out instead of focusing in. To start pointing your spotlight of attention on something higher than yourself. For both anxiety and depression, the solution is this. For about 20 minutes a day, maybe 3 days a week, you need to go someplace where you're not going to be distracted. So you go find a nice quiet room, you sit down, you take out your phone, you put it in airplane mode, you put a timer on for 20 minutes, you set that aside. And then for the next 20 minutes, all you're trying to do is be aware of as little as possible. Now, like an untrained puppy, your mind isn't going to want to sit still. It's going to want to run over here and run over there and worry about the future and obsess about the past. And each time it does, you're going to catch it, you're going to pull it back into the present moment and try to make it sit still. And then maybe 2-3 seconds later, it's going to run off again. And when it does, you're going to catch it, you're going to pull it back in, remind yourself what you're doing. You're regrounding yourself in the present moment. Take a deep breath. Focus on your breath. Focus on a mantra. You focus on some sort of object like your breath rising and falling, or a mantra like, oh well, peace. And what starts to happen is you get better at regrounding yourself in the present moment, and you get better at noticing when your mind has wandered off. And when you do this, all you're really trying to do here is lower the density of thoughts that pass between your ears. And for all those who think they're too busy to sit still for 20 minutes a day, 3 days a week, you need to loosen up your schedule. Because what that tells me is that you're not prioritizing your own health and your own well-being, because this practice not only makes people happier, but it improves health, it improves sleep, it lowers depression, it lowers anxiety, it staves off Alzheimer's, it makes you more cognitively flexible, and it literally grows your prefrontal cortex. And if all that sounds too good to be true, then just Google research studies concerning meditation, and you'll find over 1,000 studies performed all over the world that basically say the exact same thing. Hell, you'll find over 600 studies done on transcendental meditation alone. That's just one derivation of meditation. Or, if you prefer, you can go see a therapist, and they're going to try to sell you on something called cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. Or maybe they might try to talk you into something called mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR. And as they explain the concepts to you at $300 an hour, you're going to think to yourself, did these guys just take the fundamentals of meditation and add more syllables? And then when you ask them about this, they're going to say, no. Who told you that? Everything you've ever heard, every poem, every piece of music, every I love you, all happens within the confines of your skull. We have an attentional-based consciousness, a consciousness that runs on attention and awareness. Now, I used to think that meditation was just a waste of time, but that's because back then I didn't realize how malleable the internal experience really was. And so it took me about 24 years to warm up to the idea of sitting still for 20 minutes a day. But ever since then, I've never looked back, because when you adopt some sort of focus practice like meditation, yoga, or some highly engaging sport, you disengage the default mode network and you stay in the present moment. Just as having strong legs reduces your chances of injury and makes you better at almost any sport that you play, having a strong mind reduces your risk of developing a mental illness and makes you better across every dimension of attention that we can measure. So our conscious attention is kind of like a muscle. So when you don't exercise it or train it, it's kind of like you have a dog that never got past the potty training phase. And so dogs are great when they're trained. When they don't bite people and pee on things, they're awesome. So the correlation is this. We humans have 3 major evolutionary advantages that set us apart from all other life on this planet. We have an incredible imagination, we have an incredible memory system, and we have opposable thumbs. The problem is, most people don't take the time to train their minds, and so because of this, they become victims of them. If you become victim of the memory system, letting your mind wander, ruminate, and obsess, we call that depression. If you become a victim of the imagination, letting your mind generate hypothetical situations that worry and stress you out, we call that anxiety. So the answer for both depression and anxiety is this. You need to zen out for about 20 minutes a day. That's what I call it, zenning out. And during that time, your ability to start to notice when your mind is wandering starts to go up. Your ability to stop those anxious thought patterns and those negative feedback loops starts to go up. And you develop a reflex for staying in the present moment, for listening to people when they talk to you instead of just pre-planning what you're going to say next. And all of this literally grows your prefrontal cortex and makes you more self-aware. I think the question we should really all be asking ourselves is, why don't I deserve that? Why don't my friends deserve that? Why doesn't the world deserve that?